Part 1, The Hook and Thesis. The consensus question. Nausicaä of the Valley of the Wind is frequently positioned as a straightforward ecological parable, a cautionary tale about the consequences of humanity's industrial arrogance and the imperative to live in harmony with a vengeful natural world. This consensus framing reduces the film to a simple binary of preservation versus exploitation, suggesting that the narrative functions primarily as an alarmist critique of environmental neglect. However, this reading obscures the film's more profound inquiry into the nature of human survival and the necessity of myth-making. The film is actually a complex meditation on the transmutation of trauma into a functional societal morality. It posits that the true crisis facing humanity is not merely the destruction of the ecosystem, but the disintegration of communal identity in the shadow of a forgotten history. The world building of the film operates on the fundamental scarcity of clean air and habitable soil. The toxic forest is not simply a biological threat, it is a profound epistemological barrier. The humans living in its wake possess only fragmented, superstitious knowledge of their own history, treating the artifacts of the past as either holy relics or cursed machines. This creates a society defined by a profound cognitive dissonance, where the ruling classes attempt to exert control through the mastery of weaponized technology, while the common folk adapt through a localized, intuitive, and highly observant relationship with the flora and fauna. The visual geography of the film reinforces this division. The sterile, cold architecture of the Tolmekian Empire contrasts sharply with the windswept, organic, and artisanal structures of the Valley of the Wind. Power is concentrated in those who rely on the scorched earth policies of the past, while endurance is found in the fluid, adaptive movements of those who accept the reality of the present. At the center of this tension is Nausicaä, who functions as the film's bridge between these disparate modes of existence. Her psychology is defined by the somatic processing of grief and the intellectual pursuit of objective truth. While others react to the forest with fear or predatory aggression, Nausicaä practices a form of empirical research that transcends mere survival. She represents the synthesis of the scientist and the mystic, refusing to accept the prevailing propaganda that labels the forest as an unmitigated evil. Her internal life is marked by the trauma of seeing her father's decline and the repeated violence of the warring nations, yet she systematically replaces the impulse for retaliation with an obsessive dedication to observation. She treats her body and her consciousness as instruments for deconstructing the lies that govern her world. The film's philosophical weight rests on its rejection of the utilitarian calculus that dominates the antagonist, Kushana. To the Tolmekians, the annihilation of the forest is a logical necessity to ensure the survival of the human species. Nausicaä, conversely, employs a deontological framework that demands respect for all living systems, regardless of their immediate utility to man. She does not merely survive a collapsing world, she constructs a new ethical framework out of the debris. When she realizes that the forest is not a parasite but a cleanser of the world's toxicity, her understanding of reality undergoes a complete fracture. This moment is not a sudden epiphany of environmentalism, but a radical reorientation of her species' place in the biosphere. She transitions from a guardian of a dying village to a catalyst for a planetary metamorphosis. Technically, the film uses the medium of animation to emphasize the vast scale of the insectoid entities against the fragile, ephemeral humanity. The meticulous attention to the movement of the Omu, the rhythmic shifting of their armored plates and the pulsing, color-coded bioluminescence, creates a sense of alien majesty that prevents the viewer from viewing them as mere monsters. The sound design, particularly the synthetic yet organic groans of the insects and the whistling, melancholic winds of the valley, creates a sonic landscape that grounds the high fantasy stakes in a tangible, decaying reality. The cinematography relies on wide, sweeping vistas to diminish the importance of individual human conflict, forcing the audience to recognize the insignificance of the current geopolitical strife against the deep time of the ecological recovery. In its final synthesis, Nausicaä of the Valley of the Wind moves beyond the consensus reading of ecological preservation. It offers a vision where the survival of humanity depends on the total abandonment of the desire to dominate nature. The final act, where Nausicaä sacrifices her physical safety to stand between the machines of war and the forces of nature, is not a simple victory for the environment. It is an act of total surrender that results in a profound, transcendent transformation. The film concludes by asserting that existence is not defined by the ability to conquer or categorize the world, but by the courage to evolve alongside it. It is an exploration of the ways in which a society, when pushed to the brink of absolute annihilation, must discard its inherited myths to discover a genuine, albeit uncertain, future. The legacy of the film lies in its insistence that we are not the masters of the systems we occupy, but the children of their inevitable evolution. The subversion question. Nausicaä of the Valley of the Wind is frequently positioned as a simple ecological parable, a cautionary tale about humanity's reckless exploitation of nature. However, this reading collapses under the weight of the film's own internal logic, which portrays the natural world not as a fragile garden in need of human preservation, but as a hyper-efficient, terraforming machine designed to reclaim a planet polluted by industrial hubris. The consensus view suggests a binary conflict between a benevolent, green-conscious heroine and a destructive, industrial military-industrial complex. In reality, the film functions as a profound meditation on the inevitability of total system reset. Nausicaä's true agency lies not in her role as a savior, but in her role as a bridge between the obsolescence of human dominion and the rise of a new, toxic order. The world of the film is defined by an epistemic fracture. The survivors of the 7 Days of Fire live amidst the ruins of a collapsed global technocracy, scavenging obsolete technology to survive in the shadow of the Fukai, a vast, fungal forest that is, in fact, an engineered cleanup mechanism. This forest is not merely a hostile wilderness, it is a bioinfrastructure. The architecture of the Valley of the Wind, with its wind-powered simplicity and agrarian reliance, acts as a deliberate, low-tech buffer against the reality of the forest's growth. When the Tolmekian Empire arrives, their objective is to reactivate an ancient god warrior, a nuclear-age bioweapon, to purge the forest. Consensus views this as the archetypal struggle of technology against nature, but the film treats the god warrior as a symptom of a defunct, parasitic civilization attempting to reassert control over a planet that has already moved on. Nausicaä, as a character, undergoes a transformation that transcends the traditional hero's journey. Her trauma is centered on the loss of her father and her constant exposure to the toxic spores of the Fukai, yet she refuses to categorize the forest as an enemy. Her psychological brilliance resides in her capacity for objective synthesis. While her peers view the forest through the lens of human survival, Nausicaä treats it as an information-rich environment. She occupies the space between two incompatible worldviews, the extractive, violent human history represented by the Tolmekians and the Pajite, and the evolutionary future represented by the Fukai. The pivotal scene where she realizes the forest is actually purifying the water and air, taking the toxins of the past and locking them away, is the moment her worldview matures. She stops being a leader of a clan and begins to function as an arbiter of a coming era. The visual language of the film reinforces this thematic shift through scale and color. The Fukai is rendered in vibrant, iridescent blues and golds, contrasted against the gray, rusted, and blood-stained steel of humanity's remaining machinery. The animation of the Omu, with their rhythmic, pulsing lights, suggests a collective intelligence that is vastly superior to the panicked, erratic movements of human soldiers. The cinematography consistently dwarfs the individual, grounding the human characters in their own insignificance against the scale of the reclamation process. The film's technical execution, particularly the fluid animation of the flying mechanisms, underscores the contrast between the nimble, organic nature of the forest's inhabitants and the clunky, desperate nature of human aviation. Philosophically, Nausicaä moves beyond a simplistic moral calculus. The characters are not trapped in a binary of good and evil, but in a struggle of competing epistemologies. The Tolmekian Princess Kushana acts as the logical extremist, believing that order can only be maintained through the total eradication of the chaotic unknown. Nausicaä's counterargument is not rooted in pacifism, but in an acceptance of the absurd. She understands that human civilization is fundamentally flawed and must undergo a period of radical, painful adaptation. The film argues that humanity's salvation lies in the abandonment of the ego. By the time Nausicaä stands before the charging Omu, she has moved past the need for individual preservation, signaling a final, existential revolt against the self-destructive loops of human history. The legacy of the film is found in this refusal to offer a clean resolution. It does not promise that humanity will return to its former glory or reclaim the planet. Instead, it concludes with a fragile coexistence, suggesting that the most meaningful path forward is to exist alongside the forces that are currently erasing the old world. This is the core of the film's subversive thesis: nature does not require human benevolence, it requires human surrender. The struggle of the protagonist is not the preservation of the status quo, but the successful negotiation of a transition into a world that no longer views humanity as the center of gravity. The final synthesis reveals a profound, stoic optimism: the world continues, not because humanity conquered it, but because humanity finally learned to step aside. The anomaly question. Nausicaä of the Valley of the Wind functions as a profound meditation on the necessity of radical empathy within a terminal ecosystem. The consensus often reduces the film to a simple environmental parable, positioning the toxic forest as a malevolent force of nature or a cautionary tale of human negligence. However, this interpretation ignores the film's central anomaly: Nausicaä's decision to risk total annihilation by physically shielding the Omu larvae. This is not a mere act of heroics, it is a calculated disruption of the human impulse to dominate, serving as the bridge between humanity's destructive past and a biological future that has rendered humanity obsolete. The synthesis of this behavior, the synthesis of biology, spirit, and survival, proves that the film is an argument for the evolution of consciousness as the only viable path through cataclysm. The world of the film is a reality defined by profound scarcity, where the remnants of a technological golden age are repurposed for survival. The architecture of the valley, characterized by wind-driven power and rustic, sustainable engineering, stands in direct opposition to the metallic, sterile industrialism of the Tolmekian and Pajite empires. This visual hierarchy reflects a struggle over the planet's remaining vital resources. The Tolmekians rely on the excavation of high-tier, salvaged military technology, specifically the god warriors, to exert control, while the valley dwellers exist in the shadow of this ruin, treating the natural world with a reverence that serves as a hedge against extinction. The baseline reality is one of precariousness, where the very atmosphere is a lethal threat to human lungs, forcing a state of constant, militant vigilance. The protagonist's internal world is defined by this tension. Nausicaä navigates the trauma of her society, the constant fear of the forest, by cultivating an epistemic autonomy that her peers lack. While the other kingdoms react to the encroaching jungle with fire and erasure, Nausicaä approaches it through observation and science. Her core wound, the loss of her father and the witnessing of senseless violence, does not harden her into a reactionary force, rather, it deepens her resolve to bridge the gap between two incompatible species. She is the anomaly in this machine-like cycle of war. Her rejection of the violent, state-mandated methods of progress aligns her with the Omu, transforming her from a localized princess into a catalyst for a planetary symbiosis that renders the existing geopolitical structures irrelevant. Philosophically, the film posits an existential morality that transcends the traditional human-centric calculus. When Nausicaä confronts the moral weight of the trolley problem, she refuses to trade one life for the many, she instead alters the terms of the dilemma itself. By choosing to stand before the stampeding horde, she moves beyond the logic of utility and into a space of pure, radical risk. This act of self-sacrifice serves as a rejection of the nihilism inherent in the world's power structures. She does not seek to conquer or survive through dominance, she seeks to participate in the natural cycle of death and renewal that the forest represents. The film argues that humanity's primary failure is not the destruction of its tech, but its inability to recognize itself as part of a biological, rather than technological, continuum. Technically, the film utilizes an aesthetic of scale to reinforce this message. The animation of the Omu, their shifting, hypnotic blue eyes, the organic thrum of their movement, and the sheer, overwhelming density of their numbers, creates a sense of the sublime that diminishes the importance of human machinery. The visual language shifts from the sharp, rigid lines of the tanks and aircraft to the fluid, pulsing light of the forest, signaling a transition from an artificial reality to a living one. The sound design plays a crucial role in this shift, as the industrial screech of military equipment is eventually supplanted by the rhythmic, biological resonance of the insects, reflecting the protagonist's shift in allegiance. The legacy of Nausicaä is defined by this insistence on nonlinear growth. The final scene, which depicts the growth of a small, green sprout within the toxic garden, is the only possible resolution to the chaos of the preceding events. It is a quiet confirmation of the thesis that survival is not a product of strength or technological superiority, but of understanding. The film concludes not with the total restoration of the old human world, but with the emergence of a hybrid existence. By refusing to paint nature and humanity as fundamentally opposed, Nausicaä remains a rare, defiant work that prioritizes the existential necessity of coexistence over the comfort of absolute dominance. The struggle is not merely for the preservation of life, but for the expansion of what humanity is willing to recognize as part of its own living family. The synthesis question. Nausicaä of the Valley of the Wind is frequently celebrated as a foundational work of ecological activism, a cinematic plea for human stewardship of the natural world. This consensus, while earnest, anchors the film within a binary of destruction versus preservation. The film's true urgency lies elsewhere. It is a harrowing inquiry into the necessity of radical empathy as a survival mechanism in a world where history is an instrument of violence. The film functions as an argument that progress is not a technological or industrial achievement but a cognitive evolution towards seeing the humanity within the perceived monster. The world of the post-collapse Earth is defined by a landscape of scarcity and toxic encroachment, where the remnants of humanity exist as fragmented, desperate fiefdoms. The Fukai Forest, the film's central anomaly, is not merely a hostile wilderness but a biological mirror reflecting the long-term consequences of human hubris. Through its visual architecture, the film establishes a stark hierarchy. The stagnant, subterranean survival of the valley is contrasted with the expansionist, militaristic ambition of the Tolmekian and Pajite cultures. These civilizations do not merely hoard resources, they weaponize the memory of a lost technological apex to justify present-day crusades. The normal day in this world involves a constant, brutal mediation between scavenging the rusted machinery of the past and suppressing the biological reality of the present. Nausicaä, as the central psychological subject, possesses an epistemic clarity that distinguishes her from the surrounding power structures. Her trauma is not defined by the loss of her father or the violence of war, but by the deeper, somatic realization that her people's survival depends on the survival of the very forces they categorize as lethal. This is most vividly rendered in the film's visual language. When Nausicaä interacts with the Omu, the camera sheds its clinical, sweeping scale and focuses on the visceral, tactile connection between her skin and their exoskeleton. This is not a moment of scientific curiosity, it is a profound rupture of her conditioned reality. She discards the language of pest and predator in favor of an ontological recognition of the Omu as sentient beings, effectively dismantling the grand narrative of human supremacy that fuels the world's ongoing collapse. The antagonist, Kushana, embodies the logical extreme of the status quo. Her worldview is entirely consistent. She views the world through a lens of total mastery, believing that the only way to safeguard humanity is to cleanse the planet of the unclean forest. Her cruelty is, from her perspective, a form of pragmatism. The tension in the film is not between good and evil, but between two competing epistemologies. While the state apparatuses rely on the myth of restoration, the idea that the world can be returned to its pre-collapse state through brute force, Nausicaä embraces the reality of transformation. She realizes that the planet is not merely being reclaimed by nature, but is evolving in tandem with the human era that birthed it. The technical craft of the film serves this thesis by creating a physical weight for the world's decay. The animation of the toxic spores and the fluid, grotesque beauty of the Omu are rendered with a level of detail that demands the viewer abandon the comfort of distance. The music and sound design reinforce this. The score avoids triumphant motifs, favoring instead a haunting, ethereal resonance that underscores the tragedy of the human position. Every frame, from the oppressive, charcoal-hued shadows of the battlefield to the luminous, amber glow of the Omu's eyes, functions as visual proof that the divide between the human and the non-human is a construct maintained by an inability to witness the other without a gun in hand. The film's climax is not a victory of technology over nature, but a surrender of the ego. By physically inserting herself into the path of the stampeding Omu, Nausicaä commits an act of total vulnerability that forces the system to break its own cycle of retribution. She does not change the world through strength, she changes it by refusing to participate in the dehumanization required to keep the conflict going. The final synthesis reveals that the prophecy of the Savior is less a divine decree and more a recognition of the basic, human capacity to perceive the interconnectedness of all living systems. Nausicaä of the Valley of the Wind remains a vital piece of cinema because it rejects the nihilism of the apocalyptic genre. It posits that survival is not guaranteed by the strength of one's fortifications or the lethality of one's weapons, but by the willingness to abandon the comfort of entrenched ideologies. The film argues that true intelligence is the ability to recognize oneself within the monster one has been taught to fear. In the end, the cycle of violence is not broken by the triumph of a hero, but by the simple, radical act of standing in the path of history and choosing empathy over the inherited mandate of destruction. The film provides no easy promise of utopia, only the hard, necessary truth that the future depends entirely on our capacity to witness the truth of the other. Part 2. Context and world building. Systems, scarcity, and capital. Nausicaä of the Valley of the Wind functions as a profound meditation on the cyclical nature of ecological collapse, positing that human survival is inextricably linked to our ability to perceive the natural world not as a resource to be mastered, but as a complex, sentient system requiring stewardship. While the film is often viewed as a simple cautionary fable about environmentalism, it serves as a rigorous investigation into how societies organize themselves around scarcity and the inevitable failure of anthropocentric systems. The film argues that catastrophic decline is the predictable outcome of a civilization that treats the Earth as a static backdrop for human ambition rather than an active, responsive participant in its own evolution. The economics of the post-collapse world are dictated entirely by the proximity to the toxic jungle. Here, oxygen and clean water are the ultimate currencies, yet their scarcity is managed through a brutal hierarchy of technological gatekeeping. The Tolmekian Empire commands its authority through the hoarding of salvaged, high-tier military hardware, most notably the resurrection of the god warriors. This control is visualized through sterile, armored airships that contrast sharply against the primitive, wind-dependent survivalism of the Valley of the Wind. In the valley, life is measured in the maintenance of windmills and the careful cultivation of crops, a fragile baseline normal that requires constant vigilance against the encroaching spores. The misery of this existence is not a lack of industry, but a forced limitation on human expansion, keeping the population in a state of suspended animation, waiting for an end that is perpetually imminent. The film reveals the repressed desires of this society through the black market of biological knowledge. Where technology is salvaged and venerated, organic understanding is treated as an illicit commodity. Nausicaä operates in the shadows of the scientific establishment, engaging in a forbidden dialogue with the forest. By treating the jungle as an object of study rather than an object of conquest, she identifies the fundamental flaw in her society's metanarrative, the belief that the ecosystem is a hostile invader rather than a long-term reclamation project intended to purify a world poisoned by human industrial excess. Her labor, the constant, microscopic work of tending to soil and monitoring air toxicity, stands in direct opposition to the extractive, scorched earth labor of the Pajite and Tolmekian forces. Nausicaä's psychological trajectory is defined by the rupture of her inherited history. Raised to view the jungle as a site of terror, her internal reality collapses the moment she discovers the subterranean garden where the water is clean and the soil is pure. This discovery serves as a catastrophic epistemic fracture, forcing her to realize that the official history of her world is a fabrication designed to justify constant warfare. The trauma of this revelation is somatic. She carries the weight of the world's potential extinction in her own body, manifesting in her willingness to sacrifice herself to bridge the gap between the Omu and her people. Her trauma is not a deficit, but the catalyst for a radical, empathetic shift in perspective. The antagonist, Kushana, embodies the logical extreme of the status quo. Her worldview is rooted in the conviction that the only way to ensure human survival is to reclaim the technological supremacy that initially destroyed the world. Her violence is not born of malice, but of a rigid, pragmatist commitment to a system that has failed. She mirrors Nausicaä's strength, yet her refusal to see the forest as anything other than a threat forces her into a feedback loop of destruction. While Nausicaä finds meaning by constructing a new relationship with the living world, Kushana remains trapped in the pursuit of a dead one, an echo of the very civilization that caused the collapse. The technical execution of the film reinforces this philosophical divide. The fluid, organic animation of the jungle, with its pulsating spores and shifting colors, contrasts with the hard, geometric edges of the machines of war. The sound design emphasizes this distinction, filling the air with the unsettling, harmonic hum of insects and the shrieking, metallic discordance of aircraft. This sonic landscape creates a sensory environment where the listener is perpetually pushed between the beauty of nature's complexity and the harsh, predictable rigidity of human aggression. Ultimately, the film demonstrates that the tragedy of human history is its commitment to repetition. The synthesis of Nausicaä's journey lies in her recognition that existence is not a problem to be solved with tools, but a process to be understood through immersion. By breaking the cycle of retribution, she does not stop the collapse, but she changes the terms upon which humanity will inhabit the future. The final image of the film, a small, verdant sprout amidst a world still fighting for its life, serves as the ultimate argument for existential hope. It suggests that even in a world defined by the scarcity of resources and the burden of history, the individual's choice to align with the rhythms of the earth is the only pathway toward a genuine, sustained endurance. Architecture and the visual geography. Nausicaä of the Valley of the Wind presents a world defined by the collapse of industrial hegemony, where the remnants of human civilization occupy the rusted, interstitial spaces of a planet reclaimed by the natural world. The film's architectural hierarchy is rooted in the literal and figurative burial of the past. Humanity exists on the periphery of the toxic jungle, scavenging the artifacts of a previous, high-tech golden age that physically manifests as mountains of ceramic shards and corroded metallic hulls. The valley itself represents a fragile, agrarian pocket of stability, where the architecture is organic, wind-driven, and integrated into the landscape, serving as a direct repudiation of the monolithic, violent structures favored by the expansionist Tauromachene Empire. This visual geography establishes a clear tension between the encroaching biological life and the desperate, technological reach of a humanity that refuses to relinquish its reliance on fire and steel. The Tauromachene warships, massive and imposing, represent the apex of this architectural conflict. They are sleek, aggressive, and artificial, functioning as instruments of conquest that dwarf the small, vernacular dwellings of the rural communities. When the camera tracks the movement of these machines, it emphasizes their jarring dissonance against the soft, fluid, and often microscopic detail of the jungle's spores and flora. The film utilizes a scale that highlights the insignificance of human political ambition when placed against the geologic timescale of the planet's renewal. As the characters navigate the world, their transit is rarely frictionless. They move through mud, over crags, and across the threshold of a volatile ecosystem, forced to engage with the physical textures of a decaying reality rather than gliding through synthetic conduits. The production design meticulously maps the decline of the old world onto the bodies of the new. The architecture of the ancient civilizations, visible in the sprawling, subterranean ruins beneath the jungle, suggests a society that once held absolute control over its environment. This is reflected in the sheer size of the skeletal remains of giant warriors and the vast, hollowed-out craters that now act as nesting grounds for the Omu. These spaces are not just set dressing but active participants in the narrative, illustrating the failure of a system built on total domination. While the peasantry lives in the sunlight, cultivating wind power and maintaining small-scale biological equilibrium, the militarized powers obsess over the resuscitation of dormant, high-tech infrastructure, a cycle of decay that creates a profound sense of temporal vertigo, where the characters live in the shadow of a future that has already ended. The film excels in the use of scale to visualize the struggle between individual agency and systemic inertia. Wide shots often frame the human protagonist, Nausicaä, as a singular, vulnerable element within a vast, swirling landscape of color and wind. These compositions do not diminish her, rather, they serve to ground her perspective in the organic reality of the world. By contrast, the state's technological apparatus is depicted as clumsy and inherently destructive, failing to integrate with the environment's complex feedback loops. The visual language of the film consistently prioritizes the organic, fluid movement of the jungle over the rigid, mechanical geometry of the military forces. This creates a geography of survival where the architecture of the past is being slowly digested by a sentient planet. The result is a world where the power structures are defined by their capacity, or refusal, to exist in harmony with the natural environment, positioning the remnants of human engineering as nothing more than debris in a grand, ongoing biological process that requires no permission from the entities that once ruled the Earth. Epistemology, information, and society. Nausicaä of the Valley of the Wind functions as a profound inquiry into the fragility of human knowledge when confronted with an environment that refuses to adhere to anthropogenic narratives. While often viewed as a cautionary environmental fable about the dangers of industrial excess, the film operates more fundamentally as an epistemic crisis. It explores how societies construct exclusionary historical frameworks to maintain order and how the individual must navigate the violent rupture between inherited belief and direct, lived experience. The film posits that the primary obstacle to human survival is not the toxicity of the world itself, but the dogmatic frameworks, the official history and propaganda, that prevent humanity from perceiving the natural world as a complex, self-correcting entity rather than a monolithic antagonist to be conquered. The world of the film is defined by a deep epistemic fracture. The surviving human civilizations cling to a shattered metanarrative of history, which paints the 7 Days of Fire and the subsequent rise of the toxic jungle as a tragedy of divine retribution or biological warfare. This official history serves as the primary propaganda engine, justifying the militarism of the Tolmekians and the desperate survivalism of the Pagites. By teaching that the jungle is a malignant, encroaching force, the ruling classes manufacture a consensus reality that validates their pursuit of forgotten, high-tier military technologies, specifically the God Warriors, to reclaim a lost dominion. Access to this history is strictly gate-kept, ensuring that the average citizen remains starved of context, viewing the ecological shift as an existential threat rather than a necessary, evolutionary progression. Nausicaä occupies a unique position in this hierarchy as a bridge between the closed system of human dogma and the open, chaotic truth of the ecosystem. Her expertise is not derived from the dusty archives of the old world, but from a radical recentering of epistemology based on observation and symbiosis. When she discovers that the jungle is actually purifying the world, she realizes that the truth held by the central powers is a lethal fabrication. The film's visual language reinforces this, moving from the enclosed, claustrophobic structures of the valley, where life is dictated by the predictable cycles of wind and wheat, to the vast, vertical geography of the jungle. Within the jungle, the cinematography emphasizes a profound sense of scale that renders human engineering, such as the airships or the tanks of the invading armies, as brittle, frantic, and ultimately transient. The conflict arises when this inherited dogma encounters the physical reality of the ecosystem. The Tolmekians, representing the ultimate expression of the state-run propaganda engine, operate on the belief that human agency is absolute. They treat the environment as a resource to be weaponized or sterilized, mirroring the hubris of the civilization that birthed the God Warriors. Their tragedy is an epistemic one. They lack the vocabulary to describe a world where humans are not the protagonists. Consequently, their efforts to control their environment only accelerate their decline, as they are locked in a cybernetic loop where their aggressive reactions to the threat of nature provoke the very defensive responses from the forest that they fear most. Nausicaä's psychological journey is the process of shedding this linguistic and historical conditioning. Her trauma, manifested through the sensory memory of the death of the Omu in her youth, is not a catalyst for vengeance, but a foundational site of empathy. She transcends the binaries established by her peers, recognizing that the outgroups, the insects, the spores, and the people of the toxic regions, are not anomalies to be purged but essential participants in a planetary process. The film effectively demonstrates that the collapse of a civilization occurs when its governing narrative becomes so rigid that it can no longer incorporate new data. By discarding the state-sanctioned view of the world, Nausicaä gains the agency to act in harmony with the environment, transforming her role from a member of a doomed culture into a witness to a new, planetary equilibrium. The final synthesis of the film asserts that human survival is contingent upon our ability to abandon the comforting lies of our own historical exceptionalism and to embrace the humbling, often terrifying complexity of a world that does not require our permission to exist. Friction, Law, and the Catalyst. Hayao Miyazaki's Nausicaä of the Valley of the Wind functions as a profound meditation on the necessity of ecological integration, positioning humanity not as the rightful stewards of a conquered Earth, but as a biological error in need of correction. The film establishes a world defined by the Tokimeki, the toxic, encroaching jungle, which serves as the planet's immune response to centuries of industrial excess. While superficial readings characterize this as a simple tale of environmental conservation, the film is actually a rigorous examination of how civilizations, when faced with total collapse, cling to the wreckage of their past to justify their own survival at the cost of the future. The Valley of the Wind, with its fragile wind-based economy and communal interdependence, stands in sharp focus against the militaristic, resource-starved empires that occupy the ruined landscape, all of which prioritize the restoration of a lost, technological apex over the reality of their present environment. The world building is centered on the scarcity of breathable air and the relentless expansion of the toxic forest, forcing a reliance on scavenge technology that functions as a constant reminder of humanity's failure. The Tolmekian Empire and the Pajite Kingdom represent competing ideologies of power, each attempting to wield the dormant, godlike weaponry of the 7 Days of Fire to assert control. This competition for historical weaponry is the catalyst for the film's conflict, the ruling class's attempt to harness the ultimate technological power to force the environment back into submission. By centering the narrative on the discovery of a dormant god warrior, a biological machine of mass destruction, the film highlights the desperation of a species that would rather ignite a new apocalypse than acknowledge its status as an invasive, dying population. Nausicaä herself operates outside of these hierarchical power structures by adopting a radically different epistemology. Where the empires view the forest as a hostile threat to be purged, Nausicaä views it as a vital, purifying system. Her psychology is shaped by this empathetic observation, allowing her to understand the forest's language and intent long before the men of science and war can decode its biology. She is the only character who successfully integrates the somatic experience of the environment with her intellectual understanding of the world, treating the toxic spores not as pollutants, but as parts of a complex biological landscape. This realization marks the break in the character's understanding of reality. While others see the forest as an alien invader, she recognizes it as a protective filter that is reclaiming the scorched earth. The antagonism in the film is driven by a cold, utilitarian logic. The Tolmekian commanders and the Pajite survivors are pragmatists who believe their survival depends on the destruction of the forest to reclaim the lands of the past. The technical execution of the film reinforces this thematic weight, particularly through the depiction of scale. The immense, organic beauty of the Ohm and the claustrophobic, metallic interiors of the airships illustrate the divide between the two warring philosophies. The animation of the Ohm, with their shifting eyes and rhythmic, pulsing movements, conveys a sense of ancient, non-human wisdom that renders human technology look brittle and fleeting. The cinematography emphasizes the fragility of human transit, with shots of gliders soaring above the toxic landscape constantly dwarfed by the sheer vastness of the sprawling, pulsating forest below. This visual hierarchy serves as a constant reminder of the insignificance of the human struggle against the scale of geologic and ecological time. The film culminates in an act of profound self-sacrifice that serves as the final, necessary catalyst for societal transformation. Nausicaä's ultimate synthesis of her identity, acting as the bridge between humanity and the forest, proves that the path to redemption is found in the cessation of the desire for control. The ending does not offer a return to the golden age of the past, but rather a tentative acceptance of a new, harder, and more harmonious reality. By rejecting the cycle of revenge and the reliance on weaponry, the film posits that the only true survival lies in the humility of acknowledging one's place in a larger system. The legacy of the film is found in this specific, haunting takeaway: human existence remains possible only if we abandon the delusion of dominion and embrace the reality of our interdependence. The struggle itself is not for power, but for the clarity to exist within a world that we have fundamentally damaged but which still permits us to be part of its future. Part 3: The Human Element. Epistemology and the Metanarrative of the Self. Nausicaä of the Valley of the Wind functions as an intricate study of how inherited belief systems collapse when confronted with the physical reality of a decaying world. The film centers on the epistemic fracture occurring within its protagonist, Nausicaä, as she uncovers that the toxic forest, long framed as an invading, malicious entity, is actually a biological purification mechanism. This realization, solidified when she discovers the forest's ability to cleanse the earth beneath the poisonous spores, dismantles the foundational myth of her society. She moves from a reactive protector of a small, agrarian enclave to a custodian of a global truth that renders the prevailing hostility toward the ecosystem not only ignorant but actively suicidal. The gap between Nausicaä's internal state and her external discourse reveals her role as a mediator between warring factions. She consistently maintains a composed, empathetic exterior, utilizing the language of peace to de-escalate the volatile politics of the Tolmekian and Pajite forces. Yet, this diplomacy masks a profound internal silence. Nausicaä is incapable of voicing the full extent of her trauma, specifically the deep, somatic memory of witnessing her father's death and the systematic eradication of her people, because doing so would necessitate a turn toward the same vengeful violence that currently consumes the other nations. She suppresses this agony, rechanneling it into an active, almost ascetic devotion to the natural world. Her journey is defined by the limits of the vocabulary available to her world. The inhabitants of the Valley of the Wind possess a language of survival, defined by metallurgy, wind navigation, and basic horticulture. This lexicon proves insufficient for expressing the complex symbiosis of the Omu and the forest. Consequently, Nausicaä must forge a new, non-verbal epistemology, relying on sensory connection, the ability to touch the chitin of a giant insect or perceive the blue of the forest floor, to communicate truths that the political powers of the world are structurally unable to process. When she interacts with the Omu, she abandons the aggressive posturing of her peers, demonstrating that knowledge is something felt through the nervous system rather than dictated through propaganda. Cognitive dissonance emerges as a critical driver for the film's moral weight, particularly when Nausicaä is forced to kill Tolmekian soldiers to defend the infant Omu. This action violently contradicts her commitment to non-violence and her role as a healer. She does not justify this through the typical framework of war, but rather as a necessary intervention to halt the cycle of aggression. She internalizes the moral cost of this violence as a sacrifice of her own innocence, a realization that her purity of intent cannot insulate her from the bloody reality of the world she occupies. The fabricated ego Nausicaä constructs is that of the stoic, selfless leader. She sees herself as a vessel for the survival of the valley, an identity that functions as both a shield and a burden. By viewing herself solely as a guardian, she minimizes her own individual needs and trauma, effectively erasing her personal desires in favor of a collective destiny. This metanarrative allows her to endure the immense pressure of the collapsing geopolitical landscape, yet it creates a state of near-constant self-abnegation. As the film progresses, the facade of the perfect savior begins to fray, revealing a person who is deeply terrified by the fragility of her charge. Her eventual transcendence, achieved through her sacrifice and the subsequent recognition by the Omu, marks the shedding of this fabricated ego, allowing her to become a transformative force that forces the world to acknowledge a new, unified reality. The film argues that survival requires not just the preservation of human life, but the radical expansion of the human self to encompass the entirety of the biosphere. Trauma and somatic experiencing. Nausicaä of the Valley of the Wind functions as a profound exploration of human endurance, where the protagonist's leadership is defined not by external authority, but by her sophisticated somatic intelligence and her mastery over inherited trauma. The film posits that the ecological decay of the world is a mirror for the internal fragmentation of its inhabitants, and Nausicaä serves as the singular vessel capable of reconciling these two spheres. By locating the weight of history within the body rather than in abstract doctrine, the film argues that true agency emerges from a disciplined, empathetic navigation of one's own nervous system. The core wound of the narrative is the annihilation of the natural world and the subsequent loss of the human capacity to coexist with a non-anthropocentric environment. This trauma remains submerged for much of the film's runtime, manifesting instead as a pervasive, low-level atmospheric dread that dictates the character's defensive postures. Nausicaä, however, possesses a unique relationship with this somatic memory. Her trauma is not an immobilizing force, it is a sensory data point. When she interfaces with the toxic jungle, she is not merely observing an external landscape, but engaging in a dialogue with a biological record of human failure. Her physical engagement, the way she kneels to taste the soil or listens to the vibration of the spores, is a deliberate act of somatic regulation. She absorbs the environment's hostility into her own frame, processing the toxicity through her awareness, and thus transforming it into a navigable terrain. The film distinguishes between characters who view their bodies as vulnerable hardware to be shielded by armor, and Nausicaä, who treats her physicality as a permeable interface. While the people of the valley and the warring factions of Tolmekiä and Pajite rely on heavy, cumbersome machinery to navigate the harsh exterior world, Nausicaa's movement is fluid, intuitive, and remarkably sparse. This contrast highlights her primary defense mechanism: she is neither avoidant nor dissociative. Instead, she employs a radical, hypertuned state of radical presence. Her phantom itch, the phantom weight of the Omu shell pieces and the residual grief of a destroyed ecosystem, functions as a guiding compass. She does not run from the somatic triggers of the wasteland, she leans into them, using her own physiological reaction to gauge the intentions of the organisms around her. This capacity for somatic empathy serves as a direct challenge to the binary logic of the antagonists. Figures like Kushana, whose own body bears the scars of the environment in the form of an artificial limb, approach the world through a lens of defensive aggression. For Kushana, the body is a site of loss and a prison of metal, leading to a worldview where survival is synonymous with conquest. Nausicaä represents the negation of this parasitic dynamic. She recognizes that the antagonistic force of the Omu is not an external threat to be vanquished, but a physical extension of the planet's own immune system. By allowing herself to be physically encompassed by the stampeding Omu, a scene that acts as the visceral breaking point of her ego, she finally sheds the isolation of the individual. The film's visual language reinforces this somatic philosophy. The camera frequently captures Nausicaä in moments of intense physical stillness, contrasting the frantic, chaotic movement of the mechanical warfare surrounding her. When she finally stands before the golden threads of the Omu's tendrils, the film abandons the rigid, geometric framing used for the war machines. It adopts a perspective that feels organic, shifting to accommodate her position in the light. This is not a moment of mystical ascension, it is a clinical demonstration of somatic coherence. By aligning her heartbeat, her intent, and her physical presence with the rhythm of the life form she was trained to fear, she creates a new, sustainable feedback loop. Nausicaä of the Valley of the Wind argues that the survival of the species rests on the ability to integrate trauma rather than excise it. The protagonist's final, transformed state is proof that the human body, when freed from the defensive rigidity of mechanical ideologies, is capable of serving as a bridge between the ruined past and a potential future. The film concludes by asserting that the act of surviving is not a matter of winning a war against the environment, but a matter of developing the somatic intelligence necessary to survive the weight of our own existence. Nausicaä's ultimate triumph is not the destruction of her enemies, but the recalibration of the collective human nervous system, signaling a shift from a culture of extraction to one of deep, physical integration. The shadow and the antagonist. In Nausicaä of the Valley of the Wind, the antagonism is constructed through a rigid alignment of logic, wherein Princess Kushana serves as the crystallization of a path Nausicaä refuses to walk. Kushana is not a simple force of opposition, but a pragmatic agent of a militaristic state, functioning as a mirror that reflects the consequences of unchecked human dominance. Her worldview is entirely consistent with the technological, post-catastrophic reality of her people. She operates from the firm belief that the toxic jungle is an invasive, malevolent presence that must be eradicated to reclaim the earth for humanity. From her epistemological standpoint, the use of the god warrior, a relic of the very fire that once consumed the world, is a justifiable, even necessary, instrument of survival. She embodies the cold utility of a civilization convinced that power is the only shield against extinction. While Nausicaä operates from a paradigm of empathy and symbiotic observation, Kushana exemplifies the danger of a binary relationship with the natural world. This tension is mirrored in the way Kushana interacts with the environment. She treats the landscape as a battlefield to be conquered rather than a system to be understood. Her existence highlights the trauma of a world that has replaced collective healing with the pursuit of absolute control. Where Nausicaä finds the internal capacity to mourn the destruction of the jungle and its creatures, Kushana suppresses these emotional responses, choosing instead to channel the systemic anxieties of her society into a coherent, albeit destructive, political mission. The dynamic between these two leaders is characterized by a stark divergence in how they process their pasts. Kushana represents the physical and psychological toll of a history built on perpetual conflict. Her very body, scarred and reliant on prosthetic limbs, serves as a testament to the parasitic relationship between humanity and the technology it wields. She is the embodiment of a generation that has inherited a wasteland and decided that the only way to endure is to finalize the cycle of destruction. Her pragmatism is the inevitable result of a worldview that views the self as separate from the environment, demanding that the world conform to the needs of the state. Crucially, the film uses Kushana to force Nausicaä into a state of profound moral articulation. Nausicaä does not merely stand against Kushana's methods, she actively creates a new vocabulary for coexistence, one that requires confronting the same fears that drive Kushana's militarism. Kushana's insistence on using the god warrior acts as a catalyst for Nausicaä's own evolution, forcing her to demonstrate that there is an alternative to the destructive legacy of the past. The antagonist remains rooted in the logic of the old world, a system that commodifies violence to preserve a crumbling order. By placing both characters in the same crucible of environmental collapse, the film highlights how the choice to destroy is an attempt to master a reality that is fundamentally beyond human command. Kushana, therefore, functions as a warning, representing the cold efficiency of a mindset that treats the world as a resource to be mastered, while Nausicaä demonstrates the burden and the necessity of choosing stewardship over dominion. Through this tension, the film posits that the true antagonist is not merely a person, but the pervasive logic that views the survival of the species as independent from the health of the living world. The visual proof of the psyche. Nausicaä of the Valley of the Wind functions as an intricate cartography of the human psyche, where the external landscape serves as a direct mirror for the internal trauma of its protagonist. The world, defined by the toxic decay of the sea of corruption, is not merely a setting but an extension of a collective human failure, manifesting as a pervasive, suffocating environmental stress. Nausicaä, as the central figure, resides within this landscape not as a static observer, but as a person whose psyche is constantly negotiated through her spatial interactions with both the organic, fungal wilderness and the sterile, militaristic machinery of the valley's neighbors. The visual composition of the film meticulously isolates Nausicaä against the backdrop of massive, overwhelming biological forces. Whether she is dwarfed by the towering, calcified husks of the forest or caught in the relentless, rhythmic blinking of the Omu's golden eyes, the framing emphasizes her vulnerability. This physical smallness acts as a visual shorthand for her psychological struggle to remain grounded in empathy while navigating a society governed by the rigid, programmatic thinking of war. The film reveals its depth through the stark contrast between Nausicaä's public performance and her intimate, vulnerable moments within the hidden depths of her laboratory. In public, she projects a facade of unshakable leadership, employing a controlled, performative demeanor that masks the sheer weight of her grief. Within the quiet, light-drenched solitude of her basement garden, however, the facade collapses. This space functions as her sanctuary, where she nurtures the forest's flora to prove that the toxicity is an artifact of the soil, not an inherent quality of nature. The shift in her behavior within this space, captured through softer color palettes and intimate close-ups, highlights the psychological cost of her duty. She is a person who has internalized the collective survival of her people, and her private acts of cultivation become a somatic rebellion against the nihilism threatening to consume her world. Nausicaä's trauma is etched into the very fabric of her movement and sensory processing. The diegetic sounds of the wind, the rhythmic chittering of the insects, and the low, droning hum of the forest act as persistent triggers, linking her current actions to the history of destruction that preceded her birth. She does not merely witness the environment, she feels it, allowing the sounds and sights to guide her understanding of the world's complex, symbiotic reality. When she enters the forest, her movements are fluid, almost rhythmic, suggesting an integration with the environment that her antagonists, rigidly confined to their hulking, artificial airships, cannot comprehend. The film positions this somatic connection as a form of intelligence, contrasting sharply with the systematic, mechanical coldness of the Tolmekian forces. The Tolmekians act with a chilling, pre-programmed efficiency, their reliance on heavy armor and standardized weaponry highlighting their detachment from the living, breathing reality of the world they seek to dominate. The final visual manifestation of this psychological journey occurs when Nausicaä stands before the oncoming stampede of the Omu. In this climactic moment, the boundary between the ego and the environment dissolves entirely. She no longer attempts to control the outcome through strategic leadership or martial defense. Instead, she sheds the last remnants of her performative role, offering her own body to the chaotic, surging tide of nature. This is not an act of surrender to death, but a total surrender of the self-protective ego. The visual imagery, the golden light, the physical connection to the creatures, and the overwhelming scale of the stampede serves as the final proof of her internal transformation. Her facade is completely stripped away, revealing a state of being that has transcended the binary of human survival versus natural destruction. In this instant, the film asserts that profound change requires the dismantling of the ego, transforming the character from a survivor of a ruined world into an architect of a new, symbiotic consciousness. The resolution of the narrative is found not in the defeat of an enemy, but in the radical integration of the protagonist's soul with the truth of her environment. Part 4. Philosophical underpinnings. Epistemology and discourse. Nausicaä of the Valley of the Wind functions as a profound meditation on the collapse of human-centric epistemology. The film posits that the environmental catastrophe known as the Sea of Corruption is not a mere wasteland, but a complex, non-human biological intelligence that requires a fundamental shift in how humanity interprets reality. The tragedy of the film's various factions, the Tolmekians and the Pajite, lies in their adherence to a rigid, anthropocentric discourse that treats the natural world as a commodity to be conquered or a threat to be sanitized. By relying on a vocabulary of war, resource extraction, and categorical dominance, these societies ensure their own obsolescence, proving that their limited linguistic framework prevents them from perceiving the symbiotic truth of their existence. The construction of truth in the film is explicitly mediated by the artifacts of a forgotten, industrial past. Their official history, passed down through myths and fragments of ancient technology, acts as a propaganda engine that frames the toxic jungle as an invading force. This historical narrative effectively blinds the populace to the reality that the jungle is, in fact, a planetary immune system working to remediate the toxins left by the 7 days of fire. Nausicaä alone breaks from this epistemological enclosure. Her capacity to observe the jungle's behavior with scientific curiosity rather than martial panic allows her to perceive an objective truth that remains invisible to the ruling authorities. While the Tolmekians treat the landscape as a battlefield, Nausicaä treats it as an archive, reading the fungal spores and the physiology of the Omu to derive a lexicon of survival that transcends human decree. The film suggests that the ultimate arbiter of truth is not the word of a king or the tactical manuals of a military state, but the physical reality of the environment itself. The ecological system operates on a logic of radical interconnection, rendering the isolated, competitive strategies of human states mathematically futile. When Nausicaä descends into the depths of the forest, she enters a space where the sensory illusions of human pride, the belief in human dominion, are stripped away. She discovers that the very air that humans deem poisonous is a site of purification, a revelation that forces a radical restructuring of her internal and societal narrative. This discovery moves the film beyond the realm of simple ecological allegory, positioning it as an inquiry into how human societies fabricate their own realities to justify their power structures, often at the expense of an inconvenient, thriving truth. Within this framework, Nausicaä's agency is defined by her ability to synthesize disparate, silenced knowledges. She acts as a translator between the rigid, death-bound discourse of the industrial remnants and the fluid, regenerative language of the forest. This synthesis is not a passive reception of information but an active, intellectual labor. By choosing to embrace the truth of the forest, that life is a persistent, evolving network rather than a resource to be harvested, she challenges the collective hallucination of her civilization. The film demonstrates that the true barrier to survival is not the scarcity of water or oxygen, but the scarcity of perspective. The characters are trapped in a self-correcting loop where their violent, exclusionary language guarantees the exact disaster they seek to avoid. Nausicaä's rebellion is, therefore, essentially epistemic. She dismantles the boundaries of the established, failing language by demonstrating that reality is an inclusive, interconnected process. By the film's conclusion, the triumph is found in the expansion of human consciousness to match the scale of the planetary reality. The characters who once viewed the Omu as mindless monsters are forced to acknowledge a non-human intelligence, necessitating a moral recalibration that rejects the binary of control versus destruction. The film asserts that a society's failure is inevitable when its epistemology is rooted in a desire to dominate the external world. Conversely, lasting survival emerges when individuals cultivate the humility to recognize that their language and their laws are merely secondary to the profound, silent intelligence of the living earth. Nausicaä stands as the ultimate synthesis of this philosophy, proving that the individual's capacity to perceive truth is the final, necessary condition for the continuation of humanity in a world that has already moved far beyond their comprehension. Metanarratives and social theory. The collapse of the grand narrative in Nausicaä of the Valley of the Wind is defined by the absolute failure of industrial humanism, a legacy of technological hubris that burned the world to ash during the 7 days of fire. The film exists in the wake of this cataclysm, where the survivors attempt to reconstruct order atop the calcified remnants of a civilization that prioritized the subjugation of nature over its stewardship. By the time the story begins, the ideological state apparatuses, specifically the warring ideologies of the Tolmekian military machine and the Pajite survivors, rely on the memory of past mastery to justify current expansionism. They view the toxic jungle not as an ecosystem, but as a site of resource extraction and a strategic obstacle to be eradicated by the very same scorched earth weaponry that caused the collapse in the first place. This tension between the survival of the species and the survival of the planet highlights the film's departure from anthropocentric moral frameworks. The ruling classes operate under an illusion of control, believing that by repurposing the God Warrior, the ultimate instrument of the former Golden Age, they can impose a new order. The film presents this as a profound epistemological error. The state apparatus relies on a linear view of progress, where total technological dominance serves as the only legitimate resolution to scarcity. This mindset is fundamentally incompatible with the cyclical reality of the jungle, which functions as an autopoietic system designed for planetary purification rather than human convenience. The film meticulously avoids framing this conflict through a simple duality of good versus evil. Instead, it places the characters in a situation where the pursuit of human progress, represented by the rapid industrialization of Tolmekia, is revealed as a form of self-destruction. Nausicaä, as the central protagonist, breaks the hegemony of this destructive metanarrative by shifting her epistemic stance. Through her study of the forest's mycelial network, she recognizes that the jungle is not an invading force but a biological filter, scrubbing the world of the toxins left by the previous generation. Her ability to synthesize information outside the accepted dogmas of her contemporaries allows her to perceive a reality that others reject because it denies their sense of human supremacy. Consequently, the film explores the ethics of knowledge in an era of collapse. The antagonism presented by characters like Kushana is rooted in a pragmatic, albeit blinded, dedication to stability. They view the destruction of the ecosystem as a necessary cost for human security. The film challenges this by showing how the commodification of conflict, where individuals are treated as tactical units and nature as a resource to be tamed, inevitably cycles back to the same total annihilation that defines the backstory of the world. The truth in this universe is not found in the archives of lost technology, but in the somatic connection Nausicaä maintains with the natural environment. Her struggle is to align human action with this biological reality, moving away from a command and control paradigm toward a model of symbiotic coexistence. The final synthesis of the film reinforces this shift. By rejecting the use of the God Warrior to force an outcome, Nausicaä interrupts the cycle of violence. The film posits that the only path out of the trap of human-driven apocalypse is the radical rejection of the desire to dominate. The visual language, transitioning from the sterile, rigid architecture of military ships to the fluid, overgrown life of the deeper jungle, underscores this transition from a death-obsessed past to a future predicated on ecological reciprocity. Nausicaä becomes the agent who breaks the deterministic loop, proving that when the overarching narrative of human mastery falls, the individual is not liberated into chaos, but into the potential for a new, grounded moral existence. The resolution is not a restoration of the old world, but a courageous step into a reality where humanity is merely one part of a larger, living system, finally liberated from the burden of believing it is the system's architect. Ethics and the moral calculus. Nausicaä of the Valley of the Wind functions as an intricate exploration of a post-industrial moral landscape, where the survival of the human species is contingent upon the rejection of anthropocentric dominance. The film posits that ethics in a dying world cannot be restricted to the protection of humanity alone. Rather, true morality emerges from an active, empathetic recognition of the biosphere as a sentient, interconnected entity. Nausicaä serves as the catalyst for this paradigm shift, operating not through the detached calculations of statecraft, but through an radical, embodied engagement with the very forces her society deems malevolent. The film presents a rigid moral calculus in the conflict between the Valley of the Wind and the Tolmekian Empire. The Tolmekians represent a classic utilitarian framework, wherein the ends, the total eradication of the toxic jungle to reclaim a human-centric past, justify the violent exploitation of non-human life. They treat the giant warrior and the Omu as mere tools or obstacles, reducing the complex biological mechanisms of the world to raw assets. Nausicaä's resistance is a direct rejection of this logic. Her ethics are rooted in the belief that the monstrous nature of the Omu and the lethality of the jungle are symptomatic of humanity's own history of destruction. She chooses to suffer with the truth, investigating the jungle's secrets rather than retreating into the comfortable, state-sanctioned ignorance that views nature as an enemy to be conquered. Nausicaä's personhood is defined by her capacity for radical empathy, which extends to the non-human. When she interacts with the Omu, the film validates the idea that moral status is not an inherent trait granted by biology, but a reciprocal recognition between beings. She acknowledges the pain of the Omu as equivalent to her own, thereby dismantling the hierarchy that places humans at the pinnacle of value. This is not a passive stance but an act of rebellion against a world defined by transactional violence. By positioning herself as a bridge between two warring realities, the technological drive to dominate and the biological drive to reclaim, she practices a form of moral agency that seeks synthesis rather than victory. The ideological divergence between Nausicaä and her antagonists, such as Kushana, is found in their relationship to the means of their objectives. Kushana views the world through a lens of militarized necessity. She believes that force is the only language the environment understands. Nausicaä, however, demonstrates that the means of survival must mirror the desired end. Her decision to stand before the stampeding Omu is an act of total vulnerability, an abandonment of the self-protective mechanisms that define political power. This moment is the film's definitive rejection of nihilism. Where the system demands a sacrifice of the future to secure the present, Nausicaä risks her own existence to facilitate the unfolding of a more complex, symbiotic future. The film further challenges the audience to consider the moral weight of knowledge in a decaying ecosystem. In a world where historical narratives have been corrupted, the ability to read the signs of the earth becomes the highest form of duty. Nausicaä's discovery of the jungle's true function, as an agent of purification for a poisoned world, renders the prevailing political ideologies obsolete. The act of knowing creates an inescapable moral burden, one that necessitates a complete restructuring of one's allegiances. She does not merely survive, she constructs a new, localized meaning grounded in the preservation of the life cycle. The film concludes that the struggle to understand and protect the non-human, despite the inherent danger, is the only path toward genuine existence. By the final frame, the narrative validates that the individual's commitment to empathy, even when confronted with an overwhelming and indifferent environment, is sufficient to alter the trajectory of a civilization. Determinism, agency, and time. The philosophical core of Nausicaä of the Valley of the Wind asserts that individual agency is not merely a tool for survival, but the foundational force required to interrupt the rigid, deterministic cycles of an entropic world. The film posits a reality governed by massive, systemic momentum, the encroaching toxic jungle, the inevitable decay of industrial societies, and the cyclical nature of human warfare. In this environment, most characters operate as extensions of their survival instincts or inherited grievances, functioning as predictable cogs within a decaying machine. Nausicaä represents the singular anomaly, an individual who exercises radical agency to decouple herself from these predetermined paths, effectively demonstrating that the struggle against inevitable collapse is an act of creation in its own right. The film presents a world where the past dictates the limitations of the present. The catastrophic history of the 7 Days of Fire serves as a static blueprint for the surviving civilizations, forcing them into a recursive loop of fear, technological hoarding, and ecological violence. Characters like Kushana and the citizens of Pajite view the world through a lens of rigid structuralism, where the only logical response to the system of the toxic jungle is total domination or total extermination. Their actions are mathematically derived from a premise of scarcity and survival, rendering their agency an illusion. They are merely reacting to the environment as programmed by their trauma. They remain trapped within a framework where the individual is disposable, and the system, whether it be the militarized state or the defensive mechanics of the Omu, inevitably consumes those who attempt to control it through force. Nausicaä's deviation from this path begins with her rejection of the binary logic that defines her peers. Where others see the toxic jungle as a hostile foreign entity to be eradicated, she perceives it as a complex, evolving system of reclamation. Her agency is marked by the burden of choice. She consistently chooses curiosity and empathy over the safety of established defensive protocols. This freedom does not bring the liberation of an easy life. Crucially, the film concludes with a synthesis that validates the struggle itself. As the prophecy is fulfilled through her sacrifice and rebirth, the narrative does not suggest that the problems of the world have been permanently solved or that the system has vanished. Instead, it argues for the necessity of persistent, individual intervention. The final frame offers a vision of existential hope. It is the belief that the effort to understand, to forgive, and to protect is the only meaningful response to an uncaring, entropic universe. Nausicaa does not fix the world in a final, mechanical sense, but she successfully alters the trajectory of human interaction with nature. Her agency creates a ripple that invalidates the inevitability of total war. By the end of the film, the individual is shown to be capable of transcending the structural limitations of their time. The characters who chose violence were discarded by the systems they sought to preserve, while Nausicaa, by acting against the grain of her society's inherited trauma, establishes a new, sustainable paradigm. The film asserts that the human spirit, when operating with full awareness of its place in the natural order, possesses the capacity to rewrite the rules of its own extinction. The struggle is the meaning. In the act of standing against the momentum of doom, the protagonist carves out a space where the future is not a destination to be endured, but a possibility to be cultivated. Part 5: The Craft and Illusion. Cinematography and Spatial Language. The cinematic language of Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind functions as a sophisticated apparatus for mapping the fragile intersection between human survival and the reclaiming forces of the natural world. The film utilizes a precise visual hierarchy to establish power dynamics, moving beyond simple character positioning to articulate the philosophical weight of its environment. When light acts as the final arbiter of truth within this visual framework. The film employs a motif of shifting illumination to distinguish between the artificial and the authentic. The technological hubris of the humans, seen in the reactivation of the giant warrior or the massive tank engines, is characterized by harsh, high-contrast lighting that flattens the depth of the frame and conceals the ecological consequences of their actions. In direct opposition, the scenes centered on the sea of corruption are bathed in a soft, diffused, and almost ethereal light that emanates from the spores and flora themselves. This light does not merely illuminate the space, it reveals the hidden, restorative truths of the environment, guiding Nausicaa toward her final epiphany. Through the meticulous alignment of camera movement, color, and light, the film constructs a visual reality where the survival of the individual is entirely predicated on their capacity to align their perspective with the vast, rhythmic persistence of the natural world. VFX, CGI, and the technical uncanny. Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind functions as a masterclass in the technical communication of a world defined by both organic decomposition and industrial overreach. The film achieves its pervasive sense of environmental dread through a meticulous integration of cell animation techniques that simulate complex biological physics. While the production predates the era of digital rendering, it employs an analog technical uncanny that achieves the same psychological effect through the sheer density of detail in the toxic jungle's shifting ecosystem. The filmmakers utilize a layering process in the multiplane camera shots to create a sense of environmental depth, where the foreground flora, often rendered with hyper-detailed, serrated textures, appears to physically loom over the characters. This spatial layering forces the viewer to perceive the jungle as a sentient, heavy presence that possesses its own internal gravity, distinct from the lighter, airy atmosphere of the valley itself. The film's technical language relies heavily on the depiction of scale and weight to anchor its philosophical inquiries into human hubris. When the omu, the gargantuan, chitinous insects of the forest, traverse the landscape, their animation reflects a strict adherence to physical mass. Each movement of their multisegmented bodies conveys the immense kinetic energy inherent in their size, ensuring that when they collide with human machinery, the resulting destruction feels absolute and inevitable. The animators imbue these creatures with a terrifying fluidity that bridges the gap between the natural and the synthetic. By emphasizing the rhythmic, pulsating bioluminescence of the omu's eyes, which transition from a soft, calming blue to a violent, pulsating red, the film utilizes color temperature as a direct indicator of ecological hostility. This visual signal acts as a visceral trigger for the audience, mirroring Nausicaa's own internal shift from scientific curiosity to desperate, empathic mediation. In the realization of the film's invisible effects, the studio utilizes sophisticated masking and cell stacking to create the illusion of environmental corruption. The spore sequences, where the air itself is filled with toxic particles, are rendered through subtle, repetitive motion cycles that blend seamlessly into the hand-painted backgrounds. These particles are not merely aesthetic, they function as a diegetic layer of narrative information, communicating the atmospheric toxicity of the world without requiring verbal exposition. The integration of these elements into the frame ensures that the characters are never truly isolated from their environment, even during intimate conversations. The constant presence of blowing spores in the periphery of the frame creates a claustrophobic atmosphere, reinforcing the idea that the characters are trapped within a living, breathing, and fundamentally hostile system. The craft of the film extends to the design of the flying machines, which are rendered with a deliberate sense of mechanical fragility. Unlike the sleek, polished aesthetic of standard science fiction craft, the gunships and gliders in Nausicaa are marked by visible wear, rust, and exposed mechanical parts. The physics of these vehicles, particularly the MEV glider, is governed by a focus on lift and drag that grounds the flight sequences in reality. When Nausicaa navigates the winds, the camera tracks her movement with a fluidity that mirrors her own connection to the air currents, creating a sensory experience that feels weightless and liberating. This starkly contrasts with the heavy, armored movements of the Tolmekian tanks, which are animated with a sluggish, grinding persistence that highlights the inefficiency of their brute force ideology. By contrasting the agile, organic motion of the glider with the lumbering, industrial pace of the war machines, the film uses its technical execution to visually encode the conflict between sustainable adaptation and destructive conquest. The animation becomes a vessel for the film's moral argument, proving that the tools a society creates, and the way those tools move through the world, are physical extensions of its fundamental relationship with life and decay. Audio, rhythm, and sensory manipulation. Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind functions as a masterclass in sensory construction, where sound design and rhythmic editing serve to build a reality that is perpetually balanced between archaic environmental whispers and the jarring mechanical violence of human industrialization. The film operates through a sophisticated blending of diegetic and non-diegetic sound, often obscuring the boundary between the natural world's hum and Joe Hisaishi's evocative, synth-driven score. This sonic synthesis creates a cohesive ecosystem where the sound of the wind, the rhythmic fluttering of Nausicaa's glider, and the electronic reverberations of the soundtrack feel like a singular, breathing composition. By embedding the melodic motifs directly into the ambient noise of the toxic jungle, the film invites the audience to perceive the landscape as a sentient participant in the narrative, rather than a passive backdrop. The sonic environment of the film is characterized by a deliberate layering of scale. The Valley of the Wind is established through low-frequency, grounded acoustic textures, the creaking of windmills, the soft rustling of grass, and the communal murmur of a resilient population. This establishes a baseline of domestic intimacy that grounds the viewer in the fragility of human existence. When the narrative shifts toward the ohm or the encroaching toxic spores, the sonic profile transforms. These moments are defined by high-frequency metallic screeches and the deep, guttural vibrations of the giant insects, which overwhelm the soundscape to mirror Nausicaa's own sensory overload. During these intense sequences, the sound mix consistently elevates the visceral, raw presence of the environment, forcing the spectator to experience the physical scale of the creatures and the terrifying volatility of the jungle's air. Editing rhythms in Nausicaa are inextricably linked to the character's internal focus and the external threat she navigates. The pacing remains fluid and graceful during Nausicaa's aerial sequences, utilizing long, gliding takes that match the sweeping, rhythmic movement of her glider through the updrafts. These moments of serene, fluid motion are punctuated by rapid, fragmented editing during battle scenes, where the discordance of the cutting reflects the mechanical chaos brought by the Tolmekians. The film utilizes this rhythmic modulation to track Nausicaa's shifting psychological state. Her moments of calm contemplation are held in steady, lingering frames, while her moments of frantic resistance are marked by sharp, percussive transitions that mimic the heartbeat of a world under duress. The film employs silence as a potent rhetorical device, particularly during moments of profound philosophical inquiry. When Nausicaa discovers the truth about the purification of the earth within the deep strata of the jungle, the film strips away the non-diegetic score entirely. This sudden, absolute silence forces the audience to confront the visual information on screen without the emotional cushion of music, centering the weight of the realization solely on the protagonist's solitary figure. By muting the background noise, the film creates a void that necessitates an introspective shift. It demands that the viewer, alongside Nausicaa, process the massive paradigm shift of the world's history in a space of quiet, terrifying clarity. This technical execution serves as a vital pillar of the film's broader argument regarding the relationship between the human ego and the natural order. The meticulous attention to audio perspective, where the sound mix pulls back to focus on Nausicaa's breathing or the minute clicking of a recording device, reinforces her role as an observer and translator of a world that others choose to dominate through force. The sensory experience is designed to ensure the viewer feels the weight of the film's ethical stakes. Through this careful choreography of sight and sound, the film establishes that the path to ecological harmony is not found in the loud, synthetic expansion of human technology, but in the ability to listen to the subtle, enduring rhythms of the living world. The auditory landscape acts as the bridge between the visceral reality of the toxic jungle and the abstract hope of a restored future, grounding the film's philosophical assertions in a tangible, deeply felt sensory experience. Synthesis of craft. The technical execution of Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind serves as an intricate apparatus for externalizing the film's philosophical commitment to ecological synthesis. By utilizing a highly deliberate aesthetic, Hayao Miyazaki and his team transformed the medium of cell animation into a living, breathing landscape where the boundaries between biology and technology are constantly negotiated. The visual language of the film relies on a sophisticated choreography of the frame that prioritizes fluid, expansive movement, mirroring Nausicaa's own role as a bridge between the suffocating, bunker mentality of human settlements and the sprawling, untamed vitality of the toxic jungle. The lens choices throughout the film prioritize wide-angle vistas that establish the immense, indifferent scale of the natural world. These expansive compositions dwarf the characters, effectively rendering the human struggle for territory as a transient, almost microscopic event against the backdrop of an evolving ecosystem. By maintaining this depth of field, the cinematography ensures that the environment is never merely a backdrop but a primary participant in the narrative. When the camera glides alongside Nausicaa on her MEV, the sweeping motion creates a sense of liberation that contrasts sharply with the static, compressed framing used during scenes of political negotiation. These moments of claustrophobic, tightly edited dialogue highlight the limitations of human discourse, while the wide, uninterrupted shots of the jungle represent a higher, more objective truth that the characters are initially too fearful to recognize. The texture of the animation, hand-painted with a richness that emphasizes the visceral decay of the old world alongside the neon, bioluminescent pulse of the new, grounds the film in a tangible reality. The attention to detail in the mechanical designs, from the rusted, heavy-tread tanks of the Tolmekians to the organic, skeletal elegance of the Omu, creates a distinct tactile vocabulary. The technical synthesis of these elements suggests that the machines of the past are essentially fossilized, incapable of growth, while the flora and fauna of the jungle possess an adaptive complexity. The color palette reinforces this. The muted, earthen tones of the human dwellings are continually pierced by the vibrant, hazardous glow of the spores, signaling that the future of the world resides in the very things humanity has labeled as toxic. Lighting in the film functions as a primary moral signifier, frequently employing high-contrast techniques to expose the internal schisms within the cast. The chiaroscuro effect is used to great effect when Nausicaa confronts the violent contradictions of her own rage. During the moments where she must suppress her sorrow to perform the role of a leader, she is often placed in shadow, signifying the heavy burden of the shadow self that she must integrate to reach her full potential. This play of light and dark is not merely atmospheric but serves to illustrate the psychological cost of her transition from a naive protector to a figure of radical empathy. The technical mastery of shadow allows the audience to witness her internal transformation, as the light gradually shifts from concealing her distress to illuminating her resolve during the climactic scenes. The most technically sophisticated sequences also act as the film's moral peak. The sequence of the Omu stampede, for instance, utilizes intense layering and complex kinetic effects to capture a force of nature that is both terrifying and restorative. This is the moment where the film's technical ambition directly supports its philosophical thesis, the realization that the monster is a sentient, grieving entity. The visual weight given to the Omu, their sheer mass and the intricate, rhythmic movement of their thousands of legs, forces the audience to reckon with the scale of human hubris. By dedicating such high-level craftsmanship to the representation of the non-human, the film mandates that the viewer shift their empathy away from human-centric survival toward a broader, ecological participation. Ultimately, the technical triumph of the film lies in its ability to reconcile the synthetic nature of animation with the chaotic, unpredictable energy of nature. The seamless integration of these disparate elements suggests that human intellect, when divorced from nature, is a destructive force, but when utilized to understand and harmonize with it, becomes a tool for profound regeneration. By the final frame, the technical choices, the shifting color palettes, the soaring camera movements, and the meticulous attention to the biology of the jungle, have successfully constructed an argument that transcends the limitations of its own medium. The film is an aesthetic proof that resilience is not a function of technological dominance, but of a deep, iterative integration with the world itself. The legacy of this craft is a masterclass in how visual storytelling can bypass intellectual cynicism to provoke an immediate, somatic understanding of our interconnected existence. Part 6. Synthesis and Legacy. Synthesis and Legacy. Nausicaä of the Valley of the Wind stands as a seminal achievement in animation, functioning as a profound meditation on the necessity of radical empathy in a world defined by ecological and industrial collapse. While the film is often viewed through the lens of environmental preservation, its true resonance lies in the rejection of binary conflicts. The narrative posits that human survival is contingent upon the dissolution of the ego-driven obsession with dominance, suggesting that understanding that other, whether that other is the toxic jungle or an opposing political power, is the only viable path toward a sustainable future. The world of the film is built upon the ruins of a technological zenith that proved catastrophic, leaving the remnants of humanity to scramble for resources amidst a landscape of corrosive flora and gargantuan, inscrutable insects. This environment functions as a mirror to the human condition, where the decay of the past dictates the scarcity of the present. The visual geography, a striking marriage of high fantasy aesthetics and post-industrial grit, reinforces a hierarchy where power is tethered to the possession of remnants of ancient, warlike technologies. The Valley of the Wind exists as a fragile outlier, a society that survives not through conquest, but through a symbiotic, observational relationship with its surroundings. Nausicaä herself serves as the bridge between these modes of existence, her unique capacity for curiosity acting as the primary catalyst for change. The psychological interiority of the protagonist is rooted in her ability to confront trauma without succumbing to the paralysis of fear. Throughout the film, Nausicaä encounters horrific displays of violence, both from the encroaching jungle and the relentless machinery of warfare. Her trauma is visceral, manifesting in her physical engagement with the toxicity of the spores and the deaths of those she loves, yet she consistently chooses the difficult labor of compassion. The film explores the concept of the shadow through the various antagonists who view the natural world as an enemy to be subjugated. These characters are not irrational, they are pragmatists operating within a logic of self-preservation that deems the destruction of the environment as a mandatory precursor to human safety. The film highlights the tragedy of this perspective, showing that the very mechanisms of control intended to secure safety are precisely what hasten total collapse. Technically, the film remains a landmark of cell animation, utilizing color and scale to render the natural world as both beautiful and terrifying. The use of vast, empty spaces juxtaposed with the intricate, claustrophobic designs of ancient machinery creates a sensory experience that mirrors the protagonist's internal struggle between the vast potential of the world and the narrow limits of human perception. The sound design, particularly the unsettling, chittering resonance of the omu, establishes the non-human as a sovereign force that demands acknowledgement rather than annihilation. This sonic and visual language ensures that the viewer experiences the environment not as a passive setting, but as an active, breathing participant in the narrative. Philosophically, the film transcends the traditional hero's journey by placing supreme value on the ethics of inquiry. The overarching narrative suggests that human failure stems from the refusal to learn, preferring instead to repeat patterns of industrial extraction and militaristic aggression. The resolution of the conflict is achieved not through the triumph of one force over another, but through the realization that the toxic landscape is a corrective response to human hubris, rather than an inherent malice. This synthesis of action and understanding provides a powerful critique of the belief that nature exists to be mastered. The legacy of Nausicaä of the Valley of the Wind is anchored in its refusal to offer easy, teleological answers. Its final images do not suggest a permanent utopia, but rather a shift in the human trajectory, a movement toward a more harmonious, if uncertain, future. The film leaves the viewer with the understanding that the struggle to see the world as it truly is, devoid of anthropocentric projection, is the foundational work of the human spirit. By ending on a note of precarious hope, the film demands that the audience participate in this ongoing labor of perception, transforming the act of watching into an act of responsibility. In its complexity and its insistence that empathy is a radical, practical strategy for survival, the film remains a vital testament to the endurance of life amidst the remnants of obsolescence.